Okay, lovely. Hello, good morning in Canada. Good afternoon where I am in Scotland, and good evening in, I think, India, Sri Lanka, and Singapore. My name is John Harris. I'm Professor Emeritus of International Studies at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. But as I said, at the moment here in Edinburgh. By way of introduction, I think I should say something about Circle, which is the organization that has set up this and other webinars on India in 2047. Established in February 2020 at the University of Guelph, the Canada-India Research Centre for Learning and Engagement, Circle, aims to be an interdisciplinary nucleus in Canada for cutting-edge research on India and the Indian diaspora to showcase, advocate, catalyse and foster an equitable, respectful and sustained exchange of knowledge between Canadian and Indian scholars on complex and emerging topics relating to sustainability, social and economic well-being, what's going on in South Asia generally. Today's webinar is, I think it's the fourth in a series of seminars on India in 2047, which is supported by several different departments at the University of Guelph and by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. What a moment this is in which to be discussing India's international relations, India and the world, given that, as it seems to me, at least India is rather stuck between a rock and a hard place in the context of the terrible ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I myself have though I've studied many different aspects of politics and society, economy in India, I'm far from being an international relations scholar, but as somebody who has been fairly closely observing, active in studies of India for actually a little bit more than half a century now, I've of course observed India's international relations. For quite a long time, it always seemed to me, perhaps the speakers will disagree with me, that India was a little bit of a backwater in international affairs, not really of huge significance. And it was only the concerns about potential actual conflict between India and Pakistan that really brought India into much prominence. That changed a lot towards the end of the 20th century. Partly, I think, because of the arrival in power of the BJP, of India's nuclear test in 1998, and also because of the growth of the economy, the way in which India has become such a major part of the global economy. And I think that India's stance in international affairs began to be a little bit more assertive, though still, I think, characterized by what has been called strategic autonomy, which I think, one authority on India's international relations, Raja Mohan, once said is at once vague and central to India's foreign policy, the idea of strategic autonomy, which in some ways, I think, reflects a kind of carryover of the historic Nehruvian commitment to non-alignment. But perhaps from strategic autonomy, there's now a much clearer, I think, aspiration on India's part, sometimes articulated by the current Minister of External Affairs, Subramaniam Jaishankar, that India should be a leading power. I'm rather wondering myself how the way in which India is in such a difficult and awkward position in the context of the conflict in Ukraine reflects on this history and on the aspirations for the future. Throughout the time that I've been following what's going on in South Asia, I guess that another aspect of India's international relations is the very problematic relations that India has had very often with her neighbors, and I don't mean just Pakistan, but with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, Nepal. I suppose that the South Asian region is still extraordinarily little integrated economically by comparison with other major regions. Anyway, I think that's quite enough from me by sort of way of little personal reflections on the themes for our discussion today. I'm very, very happy. I feel somewhat privileged, actually, to introduce our speakers today. I will introduce first Suhasini Haider, who's the diplomatic editor of the great English language newspaper, The Hindu. Suhasini was previously a foreign affairs editor and primetime anchor for CNN IBN, which I think is the leading Indian 24-hour English language news channel. And there she presented the signature program Worldview with Suhasini Haider. This followed 10 years, I think, Suhasini, working in different ways with CNN International. In 2015, Suhasini was the recipient of the prestigious Indian Print Journalism Award, the Prem Bhatia. And throughout her career, Suhasini has covered some of the most challenging conflicts, stories in countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Libya, the Lebanon, and Syria. And in India, Kashmir, where she was actually injured in a bomb blast in the year 2000. So Suhasini, thank you very much for joining us today. It's really a great pleasure to meet you and to have you here. Second, I would like to introduce Professor Kanti Bajpai, though in fact I will be asking Kanti to speak first, since for rather pressing personal reasons, he may have to leave our webinar before its formal end. Kanti is one of India's most distinguished academic analysts of international relations, is now the Wilmar Professor of Asian Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. He taught previously at the University of Oxford in the School of Interdisciplinary Area Studies, and was, I think, a fellow of Wolfson College, Kanti? Right. And before that, of course, Kanti was headmaster between 2003 and 2009 of the famous Doon School in India. One of his recent publications, surely relevant to our discussion today, is entitled India versus China, Why Are They Not Friends? And Kanti is a winner of the K. Subramaniam Award for Excellence in Research on Strategic and Security Issues. Our third speaker today is Rohan Samarajiva, who's had a most interesting career. Rohan, I really enjoyed reading your CV. You've done a lot of different things, but a most interesting career as an academic in the United States for quite a long time, in the Netherlands, as well as in his native Sri Lanka. And he has a long history of public service in different capacities in Sri Lanka. Rohan is now the chair of an organization which has, if I just go by the acronym, it's LIRNeasia, of which he was the founding chair in 2004 and the CEO until 2012. The acronym LEARN stands for Learning Initiatives on Reforms for Network Economies, Asia. And it's an ICT policy and regulation think tank working across the Asia-Pacific region. Based in Sri Lanka, LEARN has a staff in the Colombo office of 15 or so people and 30 or more. Rohan, you must correct me if the information on the website is out of date. More than 30 external researchers in different parts of the world. I might just say lastly that I was intrigued that underneath the title of LEARN is the sort of little slogan, pro-poor, pro-market. Some of us might think that perhaps there's a kind of a contradiction between being pro-poor and pro-market, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day. Thank you all three very much for joining us today. The sort of house rules for the webinar are that everybody please should keep themselves on mute except when and without video, except when invited to speak. We hope very much that you will have many questions or comments for our speakers, and I'd ask you please to write your questions or comments into the chat box, or otherwise using the icon which I think is called reactions, am I right? At the bottom of the screen, you should be able to use that raise hand symbol to indicate to me that you have a question or would like to speak. I think lastly, I have to say that the event is being recorded so that it can be made available later. So now, far too much of me. Over to first Kanti, and so Professor Bajpai will speak first, and I will then exceptionally ask for questions or comments to him, just in case these pressing personal matters mean that he has to leave the webinar early. Kanti, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and very nice to see you here. I think we last saw each other, several years ago in Singapore. Also great to see the rest of the panel, and particularly to meet Rohan, who I don't know. Thanks to the organizers. It's great to be on a Canadian university program. I spent 6 glorious years at UBC as an undergraduate and then as a graduate, and all my children are UBC people, and in fact, they're Canadian citizens. So it's always, it's a kind of a slightly homecoming kind of feeling to do this. And we're missing Sharda, unfortunately, but thanks to her as well for being the driving force behind this. My topic, I should just say I'm not very well, and that's really the personal reason. So I may have to leave a little early for that reason. And I thank fellow panelists for allowing me to jump the queue here. My topic is India and China in 2047. I guess this entire series looks forward to the 75th year of India's independence. And the question that's been set to me is, India and China in 2047, will they be friends? This is picked up on the title of the book that John very kindly mentioned, India versus China, why they are not friends in the present. By the way, that title was driven by my publisher. I thought it was a bit in the face, but there you are. That's marketing. So what's my answer? Will they be friends in 2047? My brief answer, quick answer is no. And that's easy enough to say because given the past 60 or 70 years of India-China relations, there hasn't been a lot of friendliness there, though it's not been without friendliness, but it's been rather intermittent. But given 70 years of a fairly dark relationship, much of the time, one might say fairly easily that the next 25 years won't lead to any great breakthroughs. So that's easy to say, but then the question is, how to arrive at that conclusion more analytically. And here I just draw on my book, which posits that 4 Ps as the answer to why they're not friends. Perceptions, perimeters, which is just a fancy word for the border problem and for the Tibet problem, and the two are associated. The third P is partnerships, and the fourth is power. So I'm going to use that framework to project forward to 2047 to assess whether any of those, and so my argument in the book is that any of those, but most likely interactively between the 4 of them, that's what gives you the precipitate, which is, a bad relationship. I haven't put weights on these different Ps. That's just too difficult and I'm too lazy, but I'm going to share the 4 Ps. The first P is perception. So since the late 19th century, at least, I show that China has had a very rather negative, disdainful view of India. This came out of intellectual discussions in China about the state of India under colonial rule and the inability of Indians to unite and eject the colonials. And the Chinese intellectuals drew the lesson that India was a broken society, fatally divided, and may not even really constitute a nation. This point of view in the modern period, that is after the communists have come to power, have been reinforced quite tactically, it seems to me, by the Chinese establishment to continue to sort of put India down in international affairs. On the other side, India has had pretty negative images of China as well, partly inherited from British colonial rulers. Indian troops and Indian businessmen and so on operated in China in the 19th century. But in any case, intellectual contact with the British, I think, gave them a kind of Orientalist view, if I could pardon that slight pun, of China. And I think, the border quarrel, of course, reinforced visions of the Chinese as being a kind of, violent and sort of obstreperous and unwilling to really negotiate and be friendly. And of course, it's been compounded by Indian social racism at home. So I think quite a lot of as it were, racism towards people who look Chinese. And we can see that in the treatment of people from northeastern India, for instance. If we look at the worldviews of these two countries, I won't summarize the worldviews I parade through the book, but what's striking is that in contemporary China, there's not a single worldview that places India higher than a kind of medium power and at best a junior partner of China. And amongst the Indian worldviews, if we take out the Tagore-Gandhi cosmopolitan view of the world, then Indian worldviews identify China as a rival, either as a neighbor on a Kautilyan kind of reading, all your neighbors in Kautilya's mandala are your potential rivals, if not rivals. And if you take a great power view, then China has been unhelpful to India and has tried to sort of keep India down from becoming, as it were, a great power, which is its destiny. And I think, so the first question is this likely to change? And my sense is that, if anything, this may get worse. And one of the reasons I say this is that social media, if you look at some of the studies of social media by people like Chaudhary and Simon Shen in Hong Kong and others, what comes through, and of course I understand social media tends to be on the extreme, but the social media displays very extreme reinforced views of India as a backward, rather hopeless place. And there's a lot of racist commentary there as well. And I think quite a lot of that replayed in Kuan by Indian social media about China. So it seems to me that there's a dynamic at work through social media that in fact is making perceptions worse rather than drawing the two societies together. There are other forces at play, but I think that's a very important one. On the perimeters, there's a very complicated history of on the border, and I'm not going to replay it. But the salient fact is that India and China have negotiated since 1981 on the border, almost without break, and they are still not friends, and they haven't come to a resolution of the border. And the fundamental problems are two, at least. The first is that China wants to revise what it regards as imperial and colonially imposed boundaries. India wants to stay with the status quo. So that's a very kind of salient difference. The other is that they don't trust each other. Now, to say that they don't trust each other is, of course, a bit tautological. So you don't trust each other because you have a conflict, and you have a conflict because you don't trust each other. But tautologies can be useful. The question is, why don't they trust each other? And I would go back to the formative years where I think on a reading of that initial history between Nehru and Zhou Enlai, Nehru and Mao Zedong, they both presented rather dubious perspectives on their claims. Each knew that the other side's claims were dubious. They assigned them to bad faith, whereas in fact, it might just have been that it's two new countries with two new leaderships without any great international exposure. I mean, Nehru was a lawyer, but he was not a foreign service man. And he didn't know foreign affairs and treaties and so on. And nor did Zhou Enlai and Mao, who were fighting a civil war for most of the time. Actually, they were sort of ignorant on border issues. And I think a lot of their kind of prevarications and changes on the issue, which led to so much distrust, was out of ignorance, to be blunt about it. But the real problem is Tibet. I mean, Tibet is conjoined to the border issue because that's where India meets China. And while they did cooperate on Tibet for a while, in fact, looking ahead to 2047, one thing we can say for certain is that we're entering a very difficult phase on Tibet. There's already, as it were, a transition, which is that there will be a Dalai Lama inevitably with the current Dalai Lama's passing. He's 86 years old. And by 2047, there will be either a Chinese-imposed Dalai or a Dalai Lama chosen by the Tibetan community around the world. And India will have a very difficult choice of which Dalai Lama it's going to go from. And you can bet that Chinese pressure on India will be enormous to choose to support and accept their Dalai Lama. I always say that whenever you think India-China problems, at base, please think Tibet. And so it seems to me that just running the movie forward, we're entering, in fact, probably one of the most dangerous phases because of the Tibet problem. And I'm not sanguine at all that things will have really settled down between India and China on Tibet by 2047. It really will depend on how Delhi plays it and Beijing plays it, but there are real dangers there. The third issue, which I'll deal with very briefly, is partnerships. And the two or three things to be said here is that historically, if you look at the quartet of big powers that India operated with, that is itself, China, the Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States, what is striking is that the only two who have never been strategic partners are India and China. So both India and China were partners with both the others, but they've never been partners together. The only time they were partners was during the Chinese Civil War and the war against Japan, when India became a base of operations for the fight against the Japanese, and Chiang Kai-shek was a bit of a friend. But other than that, they never have been. And what does that mean? That means at the highest grand strategic level of officials and politicians, they have no capital to draw on. They have no experience of and real deep understanding of each other's strategic thinking and practices, and therefore no trust. There's no capital to draw on in a conflict to tide over bad times. What does that say about the future? What does it look like? I mean, if anything, India seems to be drifting further away from China, closer to the United States and allies, without quite becoming a formal alliance partner. In IR, we use, in international relations, we use this term now, strategic partnerships, which is a quaint way of saying it ain't quite there in terms of a full-blown alliance. But that trend is likely to grow, and that's partly because, and I'm going to come to it, the power disparity between India and China. India would have to take out insurance, and the only place to go is to the United States and its allies to do that. And at the same time, China is closer to Pakistan and, of course, to Russia. India increasingly will have some very difficult choices with Russia. But the Russia relationship could weaken. So you could really see India increasingly isolated from or alienated from a sort of quasi-entente of Russia, Pakistan, and China, further driven into the arms of the United States and its allies. Last point, I mean, I think this is the one that's pretty well known. There's a huge gap now between India and China on power. Even as late as 1990, China was within shooting range of India economically. But today we know that the Chinese economy is 5 times India's size. It's at about $15 trillion. India's at about $3 trillion nominal GDP. Where will they be in 25 years? I mean, of course, it's folly to extrapolate, and there are all kinds of things that could go wrong and knock the two off trajectories. But let's assume India grows at 7% per annum, which is, long term, that's probably fairly sensible for 25 years. India's GDP could go from $3 trillion to $16 trillion, which is impressive. China, let's assume China slows down as it seems to be, but sustains 5% roughly over 25 years. It will have a GDP of $50 trillion. I mean, if that's sustainable in terms of climate change and planetary kind of, a carrying capacity, but just bracketing that, $50 trillion. The $12 trillion gap today between India and China would be $34 trillion. The military gap is not so bad. Over a range of systems, China probably has 3 times the number of systems and so on, except personnel. We're about equal there. India may, in fact, have somewhat larger numbers of people bearing arms. But that gap could grow. And one very significant reason it could grow is, of course, that China spends 3 times, last year spent 3 times on defense what India did, its defense budget. And that's probably going to be sustained, partly driven by the United States and the rivalry there between China and the US. And by the way, of that, China spends much less on personnel, much more on capital development, capital costs and R&D. India spends 60% on personnel costs right now. So the long-term prognostication even there is not good, although India at the moment can hold. So what's my conclusion? I mean, if you take these 4 Ps seriously with me, it's difficult to see how India and China can be friends. The implication, particularly of the power gap, I think is very important. And what is that? I mean, very broadly, as Shamsaran has said, former Indian Foreign Secretary, it is that China doesn't see why it should concede to a country that's going to be even weaker than it is in relation to China in the future. And India doesn't see how it can make even reasonable concessions without being accused by its own people of strategic surrender and appeasement. So you have a great kind of, stall there out of the power disparity. So final thought, I mean, how could they be friends in 2047? It's a bleak prospect, but I mean, really flowing from this, it seems to me that the one thing that India could really do something about fairly quickly is if it can bridge that power gap and the Chinese and Indians can look at each other in the eye with greater respect and a greater sense of deterrence and so on, then, they might well work their way to being friends. But otherwise, 2047, I think they'll still be glowering at each other and looking sideways or over their shoulders at each other. Thank you very much.
Can't unmute myself. I'm sorry, I had difficulty unmuting myself there. Kanti, thank you very much. So as we said, we would like to invite questions to Kanti before I turn to other speakers. I am just looking for signs of hands. I think that, okay. I have one question in the chat from Gopika Solanki, who says, under what conditions might border disputes with China be resolved? And might you comment, Kanti, on India's Taiwan policy going ahead?
Yeah, so on the border, as I said, I'm not optimistic. I mean, they've been negotiating now for 40 years. There is, in fact, a very reasonable deal, more or less, on the table. It's called the swap, which would be, if you know the border problem, the Chinese claims in the western sector in Aksai Chin for the Indian claims in Arunachal Pradesh in the eastern sector. We presume the middle sector is more tractable as a negotiation. That's been on the table since 1960. India has consistently rejected it. Now the Chinese have moved off it as well. But to be honest, it's kind of still there. Some version of that with some more adjustments and so forth might still be done. And the kind of, as it were, fly in the ointment there is that the little enclave called Tawang, where there's a very famous Buddhist monastery, is of course in Arunachal Pradesh in India. India took it in 1951, moving its troops in there. The Chinese want it, and they want it for the Tibet reason, because it's very important for Tibetan Buddhism. And so for the long term, to integrate or more solidly integrate Tibet, they've always insisted in border negotiations with India that Tibet is a very substantial claim. I'm sorry, Tawang. So I think, you know, even if the deal is kind of there and available to be finally done, there's still the very knotty problem of Tawang. One possibility is that it has some sort of international personality, which is it's internationalized. I mean, either India or China have it, but it's open to very free movement of pilgrims and religious figures. And, you know, India and China learn to live with this kind of little anomaly pretty much forever until they do actually become friends and settle the entire border. And Tawang just becomes that nice anomaly as a place of, with an international personality. And there are cases like this around the world. It will take an enormously strong popular leader, probably on both sides, but especially in the noisy democracy that's India. And I don't see such a leader on the horizon. Modi might have been that leader, but I don't think he's quite shown that kind of sort of fortitude either. So yeah, that's how it could be resolved. On the Taiwan issue, you know, it's a difficult one. India has become more a kind of proactive and open about its links with Taiwan since Galwan 2020, the melee up there. We now do actually send an Indian Foreign Service officer to hold the, whatever it is, the trade office there, which we didn't do so much of. And so that's a little poke in the eye to the Chinese. But of course, if there's war over Taiwan, and given India's closeness to the and membership in the Quad and its increasingly Indo-Pacific presence, again, India will be under tremendous pressure, surely, to play some role there, even if it's a secondary role, should a conflict break out. And if the Chinese, if the Japanese, the Americans, the Australians, and others go to the aid of Taiwan. So I don't mention it here, but I mean, the question is a good one. That's a potentially another seismic kind of event that could occur that could really derail India-China relations. And I mean, there's scenarios around that the Chinese possibly, if India got involved, would then ask the Pakistanis or themselves open up a front against India on the border, so that India, you know, was divided. And that would place India in great difficulty. A two-front war in Kashmir, around Aksai Chin, and that whole, you know, theater, you know, that would be very, very difficult for India. So, I mean, I guess a prediction would be that India will hope as much as possible that it doesn't get drawn in, that there isn't war, that it doesn't get drawn in, because it could find itself in trouble with China over it.
A second question, Kanti, comes from Bharat Punjabi. And Bharat asks, can the transboundary water issue be a flashpoint between India and China?
Yeah, I think, right. I think not, in fact, you know, as things stand. And I say this for, it's been played up in the Indian media particularly a lot. And I think that problem sort of crested. And it crested because the Indian government, quite sensibly, in my view, said a couple of things. One, over 60% of the waters in the Brahmaputra in particular really come from the Indian catchment area, from the rains there, or, you know, subsurface water that feeds it and so on. So really the issue of, you know, flows being interfered with by China, I mean, we're not there, and we may never be there given that proportion of water that comes from the Indian catchment side. The second thing that India has conceded, despite its unease, is that at the moment, the big dams on the Brahmaputra, which by the way is called the Yalung Sangpo in Tibet, as you know, those great dams are run-of-the-river, you know, projects. So the water flows through, generating power and so on and so forth, but it hasn't yet, you know, reduced the water flow. Now, the really grim possibility, two, one, if the Chinese build a super Three Gorges Dam on the so-called Great Bend in the Brahmaputra as it debouches into India. I mean, it would be quite a marvel of engineering, but we've seen the Chinese can do it. That might cause a real problem. There's no signs of that yet, although the Chinese have done some, obviously some reconnoitering and planning. And the second is, you've probably heard of the great south to north river diversions that the Chinese have done in 3 sectors. The one they really haven't done much is the sector that affects India. That is the Western River diversion. That would take waters away from the Yarlung Tsangpo and send it northwards into the regions where water is scarce. Again, it would be a fabulous, from the engineering point of view, simply a marvel if they could accomplish it. And of course, then there might be significant reductions. But again, we don't have a sense that they're very serious about that. Although, you get some real right-wing Chinese ex-engineers and commentators who kind of put it out there that China can and should do it. But I think the general view is that that's not as great a possibility as we once feared. And last point on that, there is an India-China agreement, as you probably know, on information sharing on the river water flows. That protocol is generally held.
Kanti, just one third question, and then I think we must move on. From Sanjay Ruparelia, given your analysis, Kanti, what continues to drive India to resist a deeper strategic partnership with the United States? The last week has focused on India's continued reliance on Russian arms, its historic trust in that relationship, its history of not issuing condemnation in such conflicts. How do you see the present moment evolving in the near and middle term, which is really my point earlier about India being caught between a rock and a hard place sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship with the United States obviously has improved greatly, unprecedented over 70 years or so in terms of how close we are. But notice that there are all kinds of things that divide us. There have been issues related to work visas, which is kind of resolved now, but it was a problem. There are issues related to trade. The Americans complain about access to the Indian market and so on, and there are tariffs on both sides, so the Indians have complaints too. There's the issue of American investments into India, which the Americans also complain about, saying that things are vetted too much and the system is too slow and so forth. So there's an economic grievance, I think, on both sides. Then there are issues related to third parties. Of course, the Russia problem, the problem over Iran. Now, to some extent, the Americans have been somewhat more understanding about that. If there's the Iran nuclear deal is revived, then India might be on easier wicket with the Iranians. But at the moment, again, dealing with the Iranians, which India in a sense must because of Pakistan, energy issues, access to Central Asia through Iran and so on, it's an important opportunity for India strategically. But again, it's difficult with the Americans over that. And there's Pakistan. I mean, again and again and again, every time we think that, we can blow past the Pakistan problem with the Americans, it comes back. And that's driven by many things about Pakistan. Its location, its importance in the Muslim world, the fact that it's a nuclear weapons power that could collapse, and that would be a calamity for everyone, that it harbors extremists, that it was next to Afghanistan where, the Americans fought for 20 years. And even the fact that it is, in fact, that it is close to China. And that makes it, a country that the Americans don't want to altogether lose to China. So, I think we in India think that the only importance of Pakistan is to China to hem India in, or the Americans use Pakistan against India periodically when they don't like us. But in fact, the Americans and the Chinese have stakes in Pakistan which go well beyond just the India issue. So, that's another point of difference with the Americans. There have been differences over the Indo-Pacific. When Modi came to Shangri-La and spoke, the first Indian prime minister to speak there, he said about the free and open Indo-Pacific that, yeah, great, free and open, but also inclusive. And pretty much everyone, at least in East Asia, read that as, oh, by the way, this is not directed at China. And it raised eyebrows, including in Japan, by the way. So, we're not exactly on the same page on the Quad and on the Indo-Pacific. And we could say more about the differences on the focus of those two organizations, which also I think India is not quite on board with. So, there are differences there too.
Kanti, thank you very much. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
that's
I'm
fine.
a little conscious of time pressing on. And thank you very much. I must say, for a man who's not very well, this has been a real tour de force. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that you may be able to stay with us and come back in later. But thank you very much indeed. And so I turn now to Suhasini for your contribution to our discussions.
Thank you so much, Professor Harris, and thank you so much to the Center for inviting me to speak. I should say right at the top, I am not an academic. I essentially cover diplomacy on a day-to-day basis, so it's a lot more about how things are practiced. And my view might be a little too close to the subject, in how I present it. But the subject that I was asked to speak about, Indian foreign policy in 2047, 100 years after India's independence, how do we see India's foreign policy? And then the question within that, aligned or balanced, could not have been. I mean, we discussed this lecture, I think, for the first time in October last year. And no one could have imagined that it would play out the way it has right now. And as Professor Harris said, we're sitting in this situation when it comes to the Ukraine, where the world is watching what every country does. There is now a real with us or against us view from both Moscow as well as Washington and Brussels and Berlin, which kind of looks at which way the world is going. Every vote at the United Nations has, in a sense, been recorded. In India, I can tell you from my reading of the international press, has not come in for a lot of applause, given that it has, in 7 consecutive votes across UN platforms, voted to abstain. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what this abstention means, what does balance mean, what does neutrality mean, what does non-alignment mean, and finally, Professor Harris said the word strategic autonomy really means, and how it will play out in 2047, which is not that far away. It's just about 25 years. A word about India's foreign policy over the decades, and Professor Harris in his introduction spoke a little bit about the idea that India's first prime minister formulated this policy. He was, of course, India's prime minister for a decade and more, and had already given contours of India's policy. Non-alignment, for example, is seen as this non-aligned movement, is seen as the same thing. But actually, non-alignment showed up in 1946 when the constituent debates were going on, and when then Prime Minister designate, almost acting Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, was asked to give a lecture on what independent India's foreign policy would be. And he speaks about non-alignment right there. So while it is easy to conflate the two and talk about the non-aligned movement, which is a group of 100+ motley countries around the world that really hasn't gone anywhere and now hardly ever meets even or has a common position on anything, the fact is that non-alignment was enshrined in India's independence. So 100 years later, is that idea going to survive? That's one of the questions we need to look at. And as India's foreign policy extended, there was a much more critical eye on non-alignment. There were those who said that non-alignment constrained India's options, that it was not able to take positions on right versus wrong because it was in this non-aligned movement basket, along with countries like Yugoslavia, Indonesia, Egypt, and others. There were those who said that after 1971 and India's signing of the Soviet treaty, which was essentially done in the middle of the Bangladesh war, subject of another discussion sometime. But there are those who said India wasn't even very non-aligned. It was, in fact, quite closely aligned to Russia, although India has always said it does not do alliances. It doesn't call itself an ally of any country. And then there are those who say that non-alignment essentially robbed India of the idea that it could become this big power at the United Nations, and India has consistently lost out on the ability to join the global high table, if you like, the permanent five of the Security Council. And we can have a debate about that as well. Years ago, I heard a debater trying to do something very difficult, to oppose the motion that had been put before the House, which was the motion was united we stand, divided we fall. Now you can imagine that's a very difficult proposition to counter. So what he did was he stood up and away from the lectern and said, now watch, if I stand with my legs apart, I'm actually stable. Whereas if I put my feet too closely together, I'm going to topple over. And I would say very much, that the question about whether India should be aligned or balanced was seen very much in the same way by India's foreign policy founding fathers. So not just Mr. Nehru, but the entire foreign policy establishment at the time, where they clearly seems to suggest that balanced we stand, India stands, and aligned we simply topple over. So when we look at where this foreign policy of India is now headed, and I do want to spend most of what's left of my time to really talk about the future, I would say very clearly that India's foreign policy posture in 2047, i.e. 25 years from now and 100 years after independence, will be premised on 5 different areas and 5 different very, very distinct silos that we need to look at a little more closely. The first is the level of disintegration of the global order. And I'm already assuming here that the global order as we know it, the post-1945 world order, has already begun to disintegrate. If you needed any proof, you could see what happened in the UN Security Council over the past 2 weeks, when even as the UN Security Council, the most powerful 5 countries in the world, sitting amongst the other 10, were discussing the issue of Ukraine, that President Putin actually announced the decision to launch military operations in Ukraine. It showed a complete lack of respect, if you like, for this order anymore. And I will say Mr. Putin is not alone. Whether it was the US war in 2003, and here I will differ with, I think it was Kanti who spoke about the idea of India not taking positions on these difficult issues. But in 2003, India actually not only opposed the US war in Iraq, India had a parliamentary resolution against it. But the point was that here you had the UN Security Council being, completely disregarded, as the US did, and then later as the Saudi coalition did in Yemen. They didn't wait for a UN mandate to go ahead. We saw a mandate for Libya, which was a responsibility to protect mandate given by the UN Security Council, very rapidly turned into a regime change mandate that ended up with the brutal killing of Gaddafi. So we have seen the disintegration of the global order if it is represented by the writ of the UN and its most powerful body, the UNSC. We've also seen a disintegration in the recent weeks of basic principles, nuclear safety, for example, disregarded by Russia as it went in to take over Ukraine's 4 nuclear reactors and the Chernobyl area. Whether or not that leads to a real problem, the fact that this was done so callously or without regard to the concerns of the world should worry us all. The disregard to the creation of refugees over the last 20 years. Which conflict has not created refugees? And this is against the tenets that we have all signed on to. The global war on terrorism, cast aside. There in Canada, I'm sure you see it. We saw in the UK where Foreign Secretary Liz Truss actually said that they would actually support foreign fighters going into the Ukraine and taking up arms on behalf of the Ukrainian government after a call by President Zelensky. But isn't this one of the tenets of the global war on terror, that you don't have non-state actors playing out in these conflicts? I know these are all gray areas, but I'm just saying that little by little, we're seeing that global world order, in a sense, whittle away and disintegrate. And where India stands in 2047 will be a very, very important part of that. And I can go on about the economic world order that is disintegrating as well. The WTO means nothing. The kind of sanctions we've seen put on by the West on Russia, the shutting down of McDonald's and Pepsi and Coke and cutting Russia out of SWIFT, banning banks, all done very unilaterally, not done through any global organization or platform, to the point that we are now seeing a kind of cultural world order disintegration as well, when you have artists being asked to either stand against Mr. Putin's actions or face being sacked in Munich, in New York, in Canada, in the liberal world capitals. This is not just to say that there isn't a problem to start with Russia's actions. I'm just saying that in the response to Russia's action, we have not seen the world order being held up or strengthened. And therefore, I would say that India's role, not just as an abstentionist power or a power that wants to be neutral in some ways, India's role in 2047 will be very much decided on the world stage if it chooses to strengthen this world order, or if it decides that it now needs to work with one or the other pole in a bipolar or slightly larger, maybe multipolar, tripolar world that should follow. The second big place where I think India's foreign policy will be chosen is what happens with big power rivalry. 4 years ago, I wrote this piece and I pulled it out again today, just talking about the idea that there was no more a la carte options for India, that the world was growing so polarized that it was not possible for India to say, I will take a little bit of this from you and a little bit of this from you and keep my strategic autonomy and my independence in there. Everybody is giving you buffet options, whether it is on defense, whether it is on economic issues, whether it is on even other areas like nuclear issues, which I'll come to in just a bit. What we are seeing is that this big power rivalry is deciding India's own foreign policy posture very much. When it comes to the US versus China, as Kanti put so beautifully, the fact is India doesn't have as much of a difficulty in deciding one or the other, particularly given China's actions against India at the border in the last 2 years. But when it comes to US versus Russia, again, becomes very difficult. What happens if the sanctions we have seen continue and lead, in fact, to a dollar world and a non-dollar world being created? Where will India stand over there? So I think these are questions that are going to come up. The reason I'd used compared it to a buffet option versus an a la carte option was actually because India was deciding to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization around the same time that it was actually joining the Quad. And it just seemed quite interesting that India would be part of a grouping on its continental sphere with Russia, with China, with Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asian countries, and in the maritime sphere, be standing alongside the US, Australia, and Japan. And I said there is this famous saying that where you stand, where you stand is decided by where you sit. But India seems to be sitting in a lot of places right now. So where it stands is a big question. The third area, and I know Rohan's going to speak much more about this, is India's relations with the neighborhood. And there is a big choice to be made. India, and now I speak as an Indian from inside India, we have always seen our neighborhood, unfortunately, as a kind of ring of fire around India. That there's always a problem in our neighborhood and India has to somehow leap outside this ring of fire in order to make its choices for the high table or to be in some way have a larger representation on the world stage. The truth is that this is a very, very intrinsic choice. And this is a choice the Modi government will have to make in the next few years and any other government that follows them as well. Can you actually sit at the high table just as India, just as an India with a 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people population, a GDP that's increasing? Or is the interest in India going to only follow if it is truly representative of its region? At present, even if you keep Pakistan out, India is not seen as the arbiter of its region's destiny as it once was. And I think this is a very important area for India. And we were discussing earlier how at the UN General Assembly, the South Asian subcontinent did not vote together. I mean, there are countries that voted alongside India and abstained. There are countries that voted alongside the US or voted yes to the resolution, but it wasn't a comprehensive collective effort. And that's just a small example of where South Asia is fragmenting. In fact, I should say in debates inside India, both the idea of being part of the non-aligned movement has been cast aside, but also being a part of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or SAARC, has been cast aside as well. And I think very much that India's relations with the neighborhood in 2047 will be decided really by three very quick points I'll make. One is dealing with the big brother, little brother issue with its neighbors. It will need to resolve its border disputes with each of these countries. And by that, I mean territory disputes. For example, with Sri Lanka, it's more about fishing and waters. With Bangladesh, we have been able to reduce the kind of disputes at the boundary. With Nepal, they're in danger of growing into much larger issues for the two, Pakistan, of course, and so forth. The second is that the US-China rivalry is growing in South Asia, in the subcontinent. And I know Rohan's paper deals a little bit with it, so I won't go any further, but to say that this will be a challenge to India, which was originally seen as the preeminent sphere of, had this preeminent sphere of influence. And the third is going to be whether India can shine by its power of example, in the subcontinent. Neighbors of India have always looked up to India, even if they didn't do what India did, or even if they didn't actually agree with India, or the leaders didn't agree with India. India had a certain power of example, a certain aspirational power, a certain soft power. Some of it came from the opportunities it provided, from the economy, but also because India was a country that held every religion, every language, every bit of culture, food that one of its neighbors did. There was always that connection. Now, if in one of these areas, a neighbor begins to feel estranged, I think this is going to be another challenge for India. The fourth, very quickly, will decide India's foreign policy position in 2047, will be its position on global issues that are now growing, things we never used to speak about, like climate change. Will India keep its net zero commitments, for example? On pollution, will India really be able to cut its carbon footprint? Nuclear non-proliferation, this is another issue where many are going to come, to see whether India takes a position of leadership in the foreign policy sphere or not. And the fifth, and this is perhaps the most difficult one to really speak about because it's not about foreign policy at all. India's foreign policy, and the old saying that foreign policy of any country is basically domestic policy with its hat on. But the truth is, on a much deeper level, India's foreign policy in 2047 will be very much decided by its domestic politics in the next decade or so. Most of you are aware of what is happening inside India in terms of the polarization, in terms of the fear of communal forces taking over, the fear of a much more majoritarian kind of outlook for India, one that seeks to not only subsume many of the diverse parts of India into the idea of one country which has a very, very strong center, but also the kind of other parts of democracy, the media freedoms, the freedom of NGOs to operate, the freedom for criticism, really. So those are areas where India's foreign policy will also be decided. If India can stay committed to the principles that perhaps it has come through nearly 75 years with, of being a secular, democratic, inclusive, liberal, pluralistic country, then perhaps it has the chance to remain in that balanced sphere. If, on the other hand, it chooses not to, or events take over and India chooses one way or the other, it might well find that its power is whittled to the point it needs to be aligned. It could be aligned with one side. We've already seen the kind of closeness that India has had with the West. But on the other, it might find a greater comfort with other powers that are much more authoritarian and are much more comfortable to be so. So I'm going to stop over here, and I'm happy to take questions about where we see the country moving in the next 25 days.
So Suhasini, thank you very, very much for such an all-encompassing view of the foreign policy issues that India confronts. Thank you very much. And now we turn for a view a little bit from the outside. The Polk Strait isn't very wide, but a view from outside, outside India. Rohan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to join in this conversation, and particularly maybe even in your well-researched investigation of my past, you missed the fact that I'm actually a graduate of Simon Fraser University. So we have a very strong British Columbia representation here.
I meant to say to Kanti too that he went to the wrong university in Vancouver.
Right. Well, the topic I had chosen, or I had worked out, was India in 2047 at the center of an interdependent neighborhood. Well, one of these nights, I just woke up and I said, damn, you've got to have some exceptions to this neighborhood story. You got to take Pakistan and China out. They are also neighbors. So obviously we'll have to take them out. I think I don't need to explain why we need to take them out of the conversation. China has been already dealt with by Kanti, and Pakistan is a special case. We'll have to deal with it separately. So when you take those countries out, it looks, the key determinant is, I think, the kind of thing that Kanti was talking about with regard to China and India, that disproportion of power, of population, of just sheer size, military power, etc. You have that enormously with the rest of us. So while Bangladesh is big, it's you could still say that it's quite disproportionate, being surrounded on all sides by India, while the others, of course, are grossly disproportionate. So there's this asymmetry of relationships is the central element of these relationships. So in addition to that, so that makes it difficult, that whole thing. In addition to that, there is this question of, I think Kanti made some mention of the Mandala theory, but the Mandala theory in its more modern manifestation goes as follows, which is, well, your neighbors are your natural enemies, but the minorities who are living inside your neighbors are your natural allies, and the majorities sort of follow and become natural enemies, which is kind of difficult to work out a reasonable working arrangement based on that kind of thinking. Unfortunately, that kind of thinking is still prevalent in New Delhi circles. So when you combine that with from the other side, various historical grievances. I mean, I sometimes feel like I'm still fighting the battles of the 12th century with regard to the Chola invasions, or some guy who came and broke some irrigation tanks here, right? So, with these historical grievances, yes, we have a situation where this is the least integrated region in the world, and which also happens to be a very large concentration of poor people. We might be competing with Africa on some of these criteria, but we are really up there in terms of numbers of poor people. And I think this pandemic may be pushing us even further down that road. Now, my claim is that there are some green shoots developing which have the potential of getting over some of these problems and giving us a more integrated, connected region, building in certain aspects of mutual interdependency and getting us all out of this problem of poverty and dependence and so on that we are stuck in, including India. So what are these? I will, in the rest of the time that I have, I will talk about these two things. One is what are the green shoots and where do we have sort of the wrong kinds of dependence, where things have gone wrong. So I won't only show you the optimistic view, but also show you what the wrong areas are. And in all these cases, I'm using actual examples. So let's first look at the little country of Bhutan, which is 700,000 people, less than 1 million or whatever. 70–80% of the government's revenue comes from one export. The export, I used to actually joke to them that they were actually exporting gravity, but it's export of electricity. So the water comes down the Himalayas, turns turbines, makes electricity, and it's purchased by India. So there was that incident, the first election, well, actually the second election, where at the time of the election, there was this unexplained withholding of subsidized cooking gas supplies, which a lot of people interpreted as sort of putting the finger on the scale and tipping the election in one direction or another. Now, interestingly, the electricity supply issue was never during this entire period where the dependency is much greater. I mean, the Bhutanese economy wouldn't exist without this, right? It's their primary export, it's the primary source of revenue for the government, etc., etc. But it has not been touched. So is there a difference between these two relationships? Because there are those who are making money shipping this stuff into Bhutan, but that's a very narrow, localized constituency. While on the other hand, if India were to say, oh, we are not taking your electricity, large parts of Orissa, West Bengal, Jharkhand, etc., would be in the dark or would be having greater load shedding. So you could say that in a way that's an example of a workable mutual interdependency relationship, such as what you find between, say, Denmark and Norway with regard to wind power going in one direction and hydropower coming in the other direction and things like that, right? The other example is less well known. It's the fact that India actually buys massive amounts of internet bandwidth from Bangladesh. Yeah, Bangladesh, people have this sort of stereotypical image of Bangladesh. What are they doing? Selling bandwidth to India. After all, India is IT superpower, and what is little Bangladesh doing? It so happens that most of the cables, to do internet, the kind of things that we are using now, you really need good connectivity, resilient, redundant connectivity to the sort of metaphorical or cloud data centers located all over the world. Most of the cables that come into India come on the West Coast. A few come into Chennai, but it's pretty much blank after that. In the same way with the ports, the eastern seaboard is not very well developed. While Bangladesh, which was a sort of a newcomer to this, which only got its first cable in 2005 or 6, and now has 2 cables going out across the Bay of Bengal. These are international consortium cables, quite reliable, quite modern, and so on. And I can remember actually having a conversation with some people at the Department of Communication, and they were saying, Ron, what do you think? What about our northeastern area where connectivity is very poor? And yeah, talk to the Bangladeshis, really. The Bangladeshis obviously talked. They move that kind of traffic, and perhaps even from West Bengal, down into their cables, and they send it out. So one could argue that if Bangladesh got miffed with India for whatever reason, they could cut off, make a problem for India with regard to its internet connectivity for that corner. One could say, well, that doesn't really matter. Not much attention is paid to internet connectivity in that part anyway. But on the other hand, Bangladesh would lose an enormous source of revenue for its for that kind of infrastructure that it's developing. Now, we then look at transportation, where we have an even more interesting and perhaps intriguing possibility, where currently there is the second largest Indian port, or port serving India, is actually located in Sri Lanka. So depending on how you count, 1 year it's Nhava, another year it's Colombo. And since 70–75% of the traffic going through, of the containers going through Colombo are coming from or going to India, it becomes the second largest Indian port. Now, this is kind of intriguing because there's all kinds of people interested in India. One of the terminals is controlled by a Chinese-owned company, and so on and so forth. If India were to seriously try to develop an alternative to this, which is not very easy, because developing a hub is not simply building civil works and dredging and so on, which is also a problem because the Mother Ganga keeps pushing silt down, and various ports that people think they're going to build get silted up, even in Sri Lanka. So it's not simply that you can just build a port. But beyond building a port, a hub is about economies of networking. It's because ships are coming in that it becomes attractive. And because ships are coming in, more ships keep coming in. So once a hub develops, it's not that easy to tip it and to develop another different one. Though every time before an election, we have Tamil Nadu politicians, Kerala politicians, etc., saying, oh, we don't want to be giving this money to those Sri Lankans. We want to have the container port in our territory itself. Now, the question is that the efficiencies and the connectivity that you get from this are quite substantial. So why give up on this? Now, for the Sri Lankans, it would be pretty much a disaster if India were to pull out and say, we are not sending any of our containers over there, because then this would become a backwater. Once upon a time, long, long ago, people used to come to Colombo to get flights to go to Europe. It was a hub. People used to come from Singapore to Colombo. Now we go to Singapore to get flights to go to Europe. So hub status can be lost. Depending on technology, depending on mismanagement, etc., etc. So there is that possibility that this could go. But on the other hand, there is also the possibility that even if India is serious about developing a robust relationship between this rather sensitively located neighbor, in the words of a senior foreign policy analyst, the immobile aircraft carrier parked 24 kilometers off the coast of India, it might be useful to develop this web of interdependence. And now, of course, there are some conversations about extending that to the energy side as well that I'm involved in. So I think there are these sort of positive signs, but we should not be all rosy-eyed about this because of the experience with cooking gas in Bhutan, and then, of course, what many of us call the blockade, but some people tell me not to use the word, the blockade of Nepal with regard to the constitution, etc. So there are these pros and cons, but I believe that for people like me who's working on connectivity, trade, and so on, and who want to see a more integrated and cohesive and developed and flourishing region, I prefer to look at the green shoots rather than the fear-mongering. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for such an interesting perspective. It's really, I had really no idea just how important the Colombo port is to India, or the other points that you have raised. And so it does suggest that there is a more happening that is helping to build ties of interdependence across the region, which is really good to hear of. Can I ask whether there are any hands up? I don't think I see any hands up at the moment, but I have a question which I think really is for Suhasini, from Bharat Punjabi again. Yeah, it's an interesting point. What are the steps being taken to improve the capacity and resource base of the Indian Foreign Service? India still has fewer diplomats than countries of a similar size. Yeah, I mean, the Indian Foreign Service is, I think, has historically been very poorly resourced. Is that changing, Suhasini?
Well, certainly, and the numbers are between 800 and 1,000. They're a little more now, but given how many they have taken from other services. But they remain very small, and they are often compared, very famously compared by Shashi Tharoor in his book, to Singapore, with no prejudice to Singapore's very, very vibrant diplomacy. The fact is that there is a shift now. There is a desire to take in more. There are lateral entrants being allowed, which weren't allowed before in the Foreign Service. We're also seeing that somehow the infrastructure is actually going first, and then people are being brought to fill it. So, for example, in Africa, I think we have increased the number of consulates by about 15, which means that you are bringing in more officers to deal with that, and to deal with all the new push areas for the government in particular. But I think the point is well made by Mr. Punjabi, that India's diplomats are in fact very, very if you like, overstretched because they are smaller in numbers. I think the one place where you're seeing a real increase, though, is the idea that while the ambassador in an embassy is more often than not a diplomat, you will see the commercial counselors and other areas being taken much more by ancillary or lateral entrants than we have seen in the past. It's still not. It still doesn't cover the gap. But that is one of the, if I may say, it's a weak point, but it's not an overriding weak point in the sense that when India needs diplomats in a certain area, they're able to get them there.
Right, thank you. May I just, there are some more questions in the chat box, but I wonder if I might just stick a little oar in myself. I was very happy, Suhasini, that you, with your fifth point, you know, the great importance of domestic politics, the domestic scene for foreign policy. And I think you made a reference in passing to India's soft power, suggesting that soft power has at times in the past certainly been considerable. Hasn't India's soft power really completely gone for a Burton now? Given what is happening domestically, given the extent or the implications of majoritarianism, the sort of treatment that is being meted out to minorities, which has attracted increasing attention. I mean, I wish I could feel more positive about the possibilities for India exercising soft power. I mean, what is your view on this?
But it's certainly an area of concern, but I wouldn't completely rule out the idea that India has within it the capacity and the power to shift back to a center every time you see it push out to one extreme or the other. There is no question that the kind of majoritarian forces we have seen unleashed in the country over the past 8 years, who have obviously been encouraged by the kind of leadership and the kind of election results that the ruling party has seen, is a cause for concern. But we find that, in an entire interconnected world, there are so many areas of pushback. There are not just the institutions within the country that should be pushing back, that aren't always doing their job, but they do push back in a certain sense. But I think what's happened in the last few years, and I deal with it really from a foreign policy point of view, is that people are seeing that everything is a two-way street. In an increasingly interconnected world, it is not possible for you to say my problems within my country stay within my country, but I can have an opinion about every other country around me. It is not possible. In the last few years, we have seen, for example, Prime Minister Modi really playing up the value of the diaspora, of the Indian diaspora, and by that I mean non-Indian people of Indian origin around the world, without facing a pushback of their own from that very community. After all, the pushback to the Citizenship Amendment Act came from Indians in different capitals of the world. The pushback to the agricultural bill, obviously there were a lot of protests within India, and those were there for everyone to see, the kind of pushback the government faced. And we saw that, again, it was the international diaspora that really pitched it. I'm sure in Canada, it became an extremely controversial thing. And of course, there are many here who think they've had the last laugh after seeing Mr. Trudeau deal with his truckers after telling India to be kinder to their protesters. But the point is that it cuts both ways. And, the same is true of Mr. Trudeau's remarks, that it always cuts both ways. In a more interconnected world, it is not possible to say that my problems are mine alone. So what I'm trying to say is that there has been pushback. On the Citizenship Amendment Act, not many might know that while the act was passed in Parliament, it became a law in December of 2019. We actually have not seen it being implemented yet. It has not, 3 years later, the rules for it have not been framed by the government. And while they give one excuse or another, once it was because of Corona, sometimes it's because of something else, the fact remains that they have not yet been able to implement it. The agricultural bill, the government actually had to move backwards on. Now, when it comes to the treatment of minorities, and obviously this is going to be an outstanding concern, really, particularly for this government and particularly for Mr. Modi, who has faced this for most of his political career, given the Gujarat riots of 2002, in which he was in many ways held responsible, and then he lost his visa to the United States. There was a visa ban on him for 10 years. So the fact is that there is always going to be that question. But the fact that there is that question is, to my mind, the reason that there will always be a pushback. People will always come in with new ideas to try and say, no, we got it wrong in the past. This is really the way. Populism works on that principle. Populism works on the principle of an anti-elite, anti-minority, anti-globalization, anti-migration kind of a structure. And it's not just India that has seen it. So many countries around the world elected populist governments over the last decade. So I think that the fact remains that we have to keep hoping, and that there will be a pushback, and that there will be a world, there will be an ideal world, if you like, that people will look towards. They might not accomplish it. We're all flawed democracies, as the Americans.
So I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I'm very, very conscious of time whizzing past, and there are other questions, and I should give some time to them. One question again from Gopika Solanki. I think this is a question which any one of you might like to address. How do we see India's relationship with Myanmar, Burma, in the context of relationships with its neighborhood? I don't know, Rohan, whether you have any thoughts on that one.
Yes. When one says South Asia, one tends not to include Burma, but one has to. I mean, it's a country with a land border with India. And interestingly, you have the phenomenon of BIMSTEC, which is, I think Suhasini talked about SAARC being mothballed. I sometimes think it should be mothballed. But the pity is that the alternative, which was sort of there for the taking, which was around the Bay of Bengal, which was historically a dynamic region, which had a certain integrity. This was the Chola Sea, not the Bay of Bengal in the old days. So BIMSTEC was there, and if you look at sort of my interests and the idea of sort of connectivity, infrastructure connectivity, economic activity being integrated, that then leading to more political benefits, you know, that old iron and coal steel community leading to the European Union story, which you know, it has got its weaknesses. I know I'm not going to say that is a model that will work in all places at all times, but it's as a sign of hope, as a trajectory. So one could argue that that is more realistic around the Bay of Bengal, which was a very dynamic trading community, lots of movement during colonial times across the waters. But then it all went cold after the Second World War and independence, in fact. So the question of integrating Myanmar into this conversation, into the newly developing dynamics in the Bay of Bengal region, now have become, of course, problematic because of the military coup. But then my reading of it is that military coup probably is not sustainable. And Myanmar will have to come back into the Committee of Nations. They can't be in this limbo for too long. So if you look at it that way, then you have, I would have come up with more examples about the canal project, where basically a Burmese port would be used through a canal to supply the Seven Sisters and so on. So, you know, that whole interdependency argument, which I was developing, could be developed in regard to Myanmar as well.
Thank you. That's a very the sort of comparison with the European iron and steel community is very, very interesting one. We're getting very close to the end of our time. So I think rather than, I mean, actually, Rohan's answer just now has, and in a sense, anticipated one of the questions which is there. How do you view India in 2047 with respect to SAARC, BIMSTEC and IORA? That's a question which I think Rohan has now partly addressed. There are other questions still standing as well. Is India's foreign policy to different neighbors decided by its domestic north-south divide? You know, how do different state interests come into determining India's foreign policy? But I don't think we've really got time now to address that question. I'd really just like to ask you know, each of our speakers perhaps for a final reflection, a final word in the light of the discussions that we've had and the questions that have been asked. So perhaps may I come back, Kanti, and ask you for a last word. It's lovely to see that you're still there, and I hope you're feeling better.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, I just really enjoyed the discussion and Suhasini's and Rohan's interventions. My PhD was on SAARC, actually, the thing that everybody wants to mothball. And so I guess I don't see that much of a possibility. And I think these more sectoral ones, India with 2 or 3 SAARC members and so on, is really the way to develop. And I think the government's doing that. Just a quick word on the Foreign Service. I think, you know, so actually you mentioned Singapore. Singapore only has 35 embassies, so those 700 or 800 officers are distributed over, whereas we have about 150 of them. So we're very, very shortchanged and in terms of capacity in the embassies out there, except in the very big ones. But the overall sense I have of the discussion, and last point, is that, you know, 2047 is quite a long time ago, but clearly there are going to be some very enduring challenges that we're seeing even now that will be on the table in 2047. I really thank Rohan and Suhasini for tabling those. I think they're really pretty monumental and important. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kanti. Suhasini.
Professor Harris, you began in the right at the start by saying that perhaps India's voice was not so well known in the past few decades, and in the last few years, you've heard it becoming much, much more robust. And the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar speaking about India now being able to say it wants to be a leading power. But the truth is, and I do beg to differ from you, that India has always punched above its weight. Because if you were to look at a country that has the kind of demographic challenges that India has, that has the economic, that has the poverty, which is of course part of the legacy from our colonial past, that with all of these challenges, India has actually had a voice much larger than perhaps another country with all of these challenges would have had. And that's where I think 2047 will really be an area, and I said this earlier, where you have to decide, can India seek that high table without being a representative of its entire region, without being someone who sees its neighborhood as a force multiplier, rather than right now, kind of the ball and chains around India, that they see a lot of the neighborhood. Can India choose between, can India sit at the high table and basically raise its own voice and say, here's what I demand, here's what I need? Or does it need to continue to be, in a sense, seen as the voice of the voiceless around the world, the global south, which has held India in good stead? And I can tell you that in terms of goodwill around the world, we might scoff at the ideas of non-alignment and India's old foreign policy shibboleths. In fact, the foreign minister often calls them the shibboleths of the past. The truth is that there is no country in the world where you can go where you don't feel an immediate goodwill for India because of that past, because of this idea that India stood as a kind of voice for the voiceless, a middle power that actually took so many other countries' interests along with its own. So I know a lot of this sounds idealistic, and we live in the world of realpolitik. But I think the ideas of the future, the ideas of India at 100 years, must be seen from the prism of some amount of idealism if we are to engage. Otherwise, everything is simply transactional.
Thank you very much for a very nicely delivered, stinging rebuttal of my initial remarks. That's lovely. And thank you so much, Suhasini, for participating in our event today. It's really been wonderful listening to you. Thank you so much. And I turn at last for the last word to Rohan.
Let me say a couple of things about soft power. I think it's far too early to write off India's soft power. I mean, there are no great beacons of democracy, secularism. There are no good guys in the left in the world. Some people think they are good guys, but they're not. even the nice nation of Canada has got burial yards in native people's schools. I mean, everybody's got problems, right? Nobody's perfect. So when Narendra Modi comes and talks to us about Buddhism and the values of Buddhism and how much he values Buddhism, you almost feel like, wow. And the Chinese also trying to own Buddhism as a cultural trope. I mean, it still goes on. And remember, this is not about just statesmen. It's about Lata Mangeshkar, and it's about cricket, and it's about, it's that whole lot of things that knit this place together. Because one of my favorite stories is about, I mean, even though little Sri Lanka is, I mean, we are tiny, but we are still in the first 5 of countries sending tourists into India. Why? Because we send so many pilgrims to India, right? So it shouldn't be that for such a large country that we should be in the top 5, right? But we are. But that's the way it is in these parts. So I think it's far too easy too soon to write those off. I think in terms of the future, not the immediate present, but if in terms of the future, we have these two trajectories. I don't think there are straight line extrapolations work. I mean, I would disagree with some of Kanti's comments, because I think there is still too much straight line there. There aren't these quantitative jumps, discontinuities in the analysis with regard to the economy and so on, where it's possible that China's economy will come down, or it cannot keep growing in that same way, and India's could flower. Right? Those are possibilities. So given that, and I think I agree with Suhasini, it's this whole idea, how can India be a great power without having a constellation of supportive states, a region that is basically in sync? And whether that region should include Pakistan, I think not. I think let's put the red cliff line and say that's that. And then let's move on to the other things. So the Bay of Bengal, I think, is a very interesting artifact. And more closer relationships with Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand and so on, Indonesia. I think these are all possibilities. So if you look at that trajectory, then my argument about infrastructure, connectivity becoming central to the entire relationship. What do I want India to do? Just move a little faster, because you get a sense of things, great ideas, but very slow movement. So if we can have a little bit more energy from the Indian side, I think a lot of these things will get straightened out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting last reflections. So fine, I must draw the discussion to a close. So for one last time, thank you very, very much, Suhasini. Thank you, Kanti, and thank you, Rohan, for such a very interesting set of presentations. Thank you all, and now have a good rest of the evening or a good day wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Lovely.